Okay, so we talked about the action potential. Now let's talk about the communication between two different neurons. I've drawn on the board here two neurons. Up top, you can see the presynaptic neuron, and below, the postsynaptic neuron. Now, there are some really interesting things that occur in order for the communication between these two cells to happen. So let's take a look at those. So, as an action potential travels down the length of a neuron, it reaches this region right here. That region is referred to as the terminal button. Now, within that terminal button, you have different little vesicles, as you can see here. And within those vesicles are housed neurotransmitters. They're in the red. So, what are neurotransmitters? Well, they can be a multitude of different things. They could be glutamate, they could be acetylcholine, they could be epinephrine. In this case, we're going to be referring to them as acetylcholine. This is the most common neurotransmitter that's found in both the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So, the idea for two cells to communicate is to allow the neurotransmitters from the presynaptic cell to the postsynaptic cell. So how do we do that? Well, as I said, you have an action potential that comes down the length of the neuron, down the axon, to the terminal button. What that causes is a small influx of extracellular calcium. And I'm going to draw this in green. So calcium enters the cell. What that does is it causes the movement of these vesicles to the end of the synaptic button. So at that point, these vesicles move by a process called exocytosis. And what this does is it causes the release of the neurotransmitter from the presynaptic cell into what's called the synapse. Now, these neurotransmitters, in this case acetylcholine, will cross the synapse and they will bind to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Now, these receptors that are located on the postsynaptic cell are actually associated with sodium channels. So what happens when the acetylcholine binds to these receptors, it causes a small change in conformational shape of the sodium channels. This allows a small amount of sodium to come into the cell. What this does is it will bring the threshold of that cell up to a certain level that will allow for a ton of sodium channels to become opened. And when a lot of sodium channels are opened, you have a lot of sodium influx. And if you can remember back to how an action potential works, this will cause action potentials to become fired or activated. And they will run down the course of the postsynaptic cell. And that's how two cells communicate, and that's how information is transmitted in the body. So, to recap, in the presynaptic cell, action potentials travel down the length of the neuron's axon. When the action potential reaches the axon terminal, this causes a change in membrane potential, which results in the entry of extracellular calcium into the terminal button. The arrival of calcium into the cell causes the neurotransmitter-filled vesicles to move to the ends of the terminal button. This process is termed exocytosis. The fusion of vesicles with the membrane of the neuron causes the release of neurotransmitters, or acetylcholine in this case, into the synapse. Acetylcholine then binds to receptors on the postsynaptic cell. Remember that these receptors are associated with sodium channels, which undergo a conformational change, allowing sodium ions to enter the postsynaptic cell. This in turn can cause the membrane potential of the postsynaptic cell to reach its threshold potential and start firing action potentials. This, in turn, allows for the transmission of a signal down the postsynaptic cell. The communication between two neuronal cells is extremely important. It allows signals to be passed throughout our bodies, whether it is in order to see or hear, to think, or even for a reflex to occur.